Okay, today we're going to finish chapter 4. The chapters in this book are quite a bit longer than some of the other books we've read. So, yesterday we did the first half of chapter 4, and then we'll finish it today. So, in the first half, they wake up, and their second day, Claudia decides that they should study and they should learn. And the difference in their personalities are coming out, right? She's very organized, she's very purposeful about the things she does, she's very practical. And Jamie thinks that this is a waste. I think he says something like, I don't think she understands, what it really means to run away. Right? So she wants to do some studying. So he suggests something that he thinks is going to be boring to try to get her to quit this idea. But they end up in this line studying a really beautiful statue of an angel. And Claudia wants to figure out why it's so important. She realizes it's important because there's a New York Times reporter there covering it. And of course, they have opposite responses, right? He wants to get in the paper, he wants to become famous, so he's trying to get in the picture. Claudia is doing the opposite. She's trying to get out because, again, she's being practical and thinking, well, if we're in the paper, then someone from our hometown is going to see us and they're going to tell our parents and we're going to get discovered. So they're an interesting pair. So she's insisting that they get a copy. He is saying, no, we don't have the money. And that's where we left off. He said, I'm afraid, though, that our budget won't allow this expense. They walked for a short while before Claudia said, I'll find out some way. She was determined about that. She was also determined about learning. They wouldn't skip a lesson so easily. Since we can't learn everything about the Italian Renaissance today, let's learn everything about the Egyptian rooms. That will be our lesson instead. Jamie liked the mummies even if he didn't like lessons, so they walked together to the Egyptian wing. There they encountered a class that was also touring the halls. Each child in the class wore a round circle of blue construction paper on which was written in magic marker, Grade 6 WPS. The class was seated on little rubber mats around the glass case within which was a mummy case, within which was the mummy they were talking about. The teacher sat on a folding stool. Both Claudia and Jamie wandered over toward the class and soon became part of it. Almost. They listened to the guide, a very pretty young lady who worked for the museum, and they learned a lot. They didn't even mind. They were surprised that they could actually learn something when they weren't in class. The guide told them how mummies were prepared and how Egypt's dry climate helped to preserve them. She told them about digging for tombs, and she told them about the beautiful princess Sit Hat Hor Unet, whose jewelry they would see in another room. Before they left this room, however, she wanted to know if there were any questions. Since I'm sure this group was typical of all the school groups that I've observed at the museum, I can tell you what they were doing. At least 12 members of Grade 6 WPS were busy poking at each other. 12 were wondering when they would eat. 4 were worried about how long it would be before they could get a drink of water. Only Jamie had a question. How much did it cost to become a mummy? The pretty guide thought he was part of the class. The teacher thought that he was planted in the audience to pep up the discussion. The class knew that he was an impostor. When they bothered to notice Claudia, they knew that she was one also. But the class had the good manners that come with not caring. They would leave the impostors alone. The question, however, would have caused at least 10 of them to stop poking at each other, 6 to forget about eating, and 3 others to find the need for drink suddenly less urgent. It caused Claudia to want to embalm Jamie in a vat of mummy fluid right that minute. Why do you think that is? What does she not like about what he does? He's not being inconspicuous. Remember that word? He's standing out too much. The guide told Jamie that some people saved all their lives so they could become mummies. It was indeed expensive. One of the students called out, "You might even say it cost him his life." Everyone laughed. Then they picked up their rubber mats and walked to the next room. Claudia was ready to pull Jamie out of line and make him learn another part of the museum today, but she got a glimpse of the room they were to go to next. It was filled with jewelry, case after case of it. So they followed the class into that hall. After a short talk there, the guide bid them goodbye and mentioned that they might enjoy buying some of the museum pamphlets on Egypt. Jamie asked if they were expensive. Remember, he's really into money. The guide answered, "Some are as inexpensive as a copy of the Sunday New York Times. Others cost much more." Jamie looked over at Claudia. He shouldn't have. Claudia looked as satisfied as the bronze statue of the Egyptian cat she was standing near. The only real difference between them was that the cat wore tiny golden earrings and looked a trifle less smug. And here's a drawing of that. And notice there have been a lot of objects that have been mentioned in this book so far. We're going to do an activity sometime next week, finding these objects in the museum because these really do exist in the Met and they're still there. They got the New York Times the next day. Neither Claudia nor Jamie bought it. The man who left it on the counter while he was looking at the reproductions of antique jewelry bought it. The Kincaids stole it from him. They left the museum immediately thereafter. Claudia read the paper while they ate breakfast at Horn and Hart Arts. That morning she didn't eat breakfast food for breakfast. Crackers and roasted chestnuts in bed at night satisfied only a small corner of her hunger. Being hungry was the most inconvenient part of running away. She meant to eat heartily for every cent Jamie gave her. She bought macaroni and cheese casserole, baked beans, and coffee that morning. Jamie got the same. The information they wanted was on the first page of the second section of the Times. The headline said, "Record Crowd Views Museum Bargain." There were 3 pictures, one of the record crowd standing in line, one of the statue itself, and one of the director of the museum with an assistant. The article was as follows. Saxenberg, you can find an original of the newspaper in my files. Oh, this must be her because it's called the Mixed Up Files. It's in one of the 17 cabinets that line the north wall of my office. Do you remember who was looking in the cabinets in the first picture of the book? Guessing that's Jamie. Interesting. Okay, so here's the article from the Times. Officials of the Metropolitan Museum of Art reported that 100,000 people climbed the Great Stairway to catch a glimpse of one of its newest acquisitions, a 24-inch statue called Angel. Interest in the marble piece arises from the unusual circumstances attending its acquisition by the museum and from the belief that it may be the work of the Italian Renaissance master Michelangelo. Have you heard of Michelangelo? Maybe I'll put up some photos of famous sculptures or paintings of Michelangelo's. If proof is found that it is an early work of Michelangelo, the museum will have purchased the greatest bargain in art history. It was purchased at an auction last year for $225. Okay, you know that art tends to be worth millions and millions of dollars, right? Considering that recently Prince Franz Joseph II accepted an offer of $5 million for a small painting by Leonardo da Vinci, an artist of the same period and of similar merit, will give some idea of how great a bargain this is. The museum purchased the statue last year when one of its curators spotted it during a preview showing of works to be auctioned by the Parc Bernay Galleries. His initial suspicion that it might be the work of Michelangelo was confirmed by several other museum officials, all of whom kept their thoughts quiet in a successful effort to keep the bidding from being driven higher. Right, so they're at the auction and they think it might be from Michelangelo. They're not going to say anything, right? Because then it would drive the bidding way up. The statue has been the subject of exhaustive tests and study by the museum staff as well as art experts from abroad. Most people believe it to have been done about 470 years ago when Michelangelo was in his early 20s. The statue was acquired by the Parc Bernay Galleries from the collection of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. She claims to have purchased it from a dealer in Bologna, Italy, before World War II. Mrs. Frankweiler's residence on East 63rd Street was long a Manhattan showplace for what many considered one of the finest private collections of art in the Western Hemisphere. Others considered it a gigantic hodgepodge of the great and the mediocre. Mrs. Frankweiler closed her Manhattan residence 3 years ago. Important pieces from its contents have found their way to various auctions and galleries since that time. Mr. Frankweiler amassed a fortune from the corn oil industry and from developing many corn products. He died in 1947. Mrs. Frankweiler now lives on her country estate in Farmington, Connecticut. Her home, which at one time was open to the greats in the worlds of art, business, and politics, is now closed to all but her staff, her advisors, and a few close friends. The Frankweilers had no children. A museum spokesman said yesterday, Whether or not conclusive proof will be found that this was the work of Michelangelo, we are pleased with our purchase. Although Michelangelo Buonarroti is perhaps best known for his paintings of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, he always considered himself a sculptor, and primarily a sculptor of marble. The question of whether the museum has acquired one of his lesser-known masterpieces still awaits a final answer. Okay, so that's the end of the article. If Claudia's interest had been a little broader, if she had started with the national news on page 1 and had then read the continuations on page 28, she might have noticed a small article on that page, 1 column wide, that would have interested her. The date line was Greenwich, Connecticut, and it stated that 2 children of Mr. and Mrs. Stephen C. Kincaid, Sr. had been missing since Wednesday. The article didn't mention any clues like Claudia's letter. It said that the children were last seen wearing nylon quilted ski jackets. Small help. 14 out of 15 kids in the USA wear those. It went on to describe Claudia as brunette and pretty, and Jamie as brunette and brown-eyed. Police in the neighboring towns of Darien and Stamford in Connecticut and Port Chester, New York, have been alerted. You see, Saxonburg, Claudia had found the article about the statue too easily. She didn't even look at the first section of the paper. I keep telling you that often the search proves more profitable than the goal. Keep that in mind when you're looking for something in my files. Claudia and Jamie read about the statue with great interest. Claudia read the article twice so that she could memorize it all. She decided the statue was not only the most beautiful in the world, but also the most mysterious. Jamie said, "I don't think $225 is cheap. I've never had that much money in my whole life. Totaling up all my birthday and Christmas presents since I was born 9 long years ago wouldn't make $225. Claudia said, "You wouldn't consider 2¼ cents very much, would you?" Jamie answered, "I might." "That's right, you might, but most people wouldn't. Well, if this statue is by Michelangelo, it's worth about $2,250,000 instead of $225. That's the same as saying that suddenly 2¼ cents is worth $225. That's some pretty quick math on her part. Jamie thought this over a minute. He was impressed. When I grow up, I'm going to find a way to know for certain who did a statue. That was all Claudia needed. Something that had been smoldering inside her since she first saw the statue, that had been fed by the Times article, now flared into an idea. Jamie, let's do it now. Let's skip learning everything about everything in the museum. Let's concentrate on the statue. Can we still take class tours as we did yesterday? Claudia answered, "Of course. We don't have to skip learning something about everything. We just won't learn everything about everything. We'll concentrate on Michelangelo." Jamie snapped his fingers. "I've got it," he exclaimed. He held up his hands for Claudia to see. "What does that mean?" "Fingerprints, silly. If Michelangelo worked on that statue, his fingerprints would be on it." "Fingerprints? Almost 500-year-old fingerprints? How would you know that they belonged to Michelangelo? He didn't have a police record. I don't suppose he did. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure people were fingerprinted in those days even if they did." "But what if we were to find identical fingerprints on something they knew that he did? We could compare them." Claudia kept looking at the picture of the statue as she finished eating her baked beans. "Jamie," she said, "do you think the statue looks like anyone special?" She folded her arms and gazed into the distance. "No one I know looks like an angel." "Think a minute." She cleared her throat and lifted her chin slightly and gazed into the distance. "Don't think about the hairstyle or the clothes or anything. Just think about her face." She nudged the page of the New York Times closer under Jamie's nose and resumed her pose. Jamie looked at the picture. "Nope," he said, looking up. "Can't you see any resemblance?" "Nope." He looked at the picture again. "Who do you think it looks like?" "Oh, I don't know," she stammered. Jamie noticed Claudia blushing. "What's the matter? You getting a fever?" "Don't be silly. I just feel that the statue looks like someone in our family." "You sure you don't have a fever? You're talking out of your head." Claudia unfolded her arms and lowered her distant gaze. "I wonder who posed for it," she said, half aloud. "Probably some old fat lady. Then the chisel slipped, so he made a skinny angel instead. Jamie, you have as much romance in you as the wolf in the Little Red Riding Hood." Romance? Baloney. But I do like the mystery part. So do I, Claudia answered. But I like more than that about the angel. We going to look for fingerprints then? Claudia reconsidered. Well, we might look for fingerprints. That's one way, for a start. She looked at Jamie and sniffed. But I'm sure it won't work. We'll look tomorrow, even though it won't work. And then she looked some more at the picture. On the second day, the crowd going up the broad staircase to see the little angel was even greater. The newspaper article had made people curious. Besides, it was a cloudy day, and museum attendance always improves in bad weather. Some people who had not been to the Metropolitan Museum for years came. Some people who had never been there ever came. They got directions from maps, subway conductors, and police. I'm surprised, Saxenberg, that seeing my name in the paper in connection with Michelangelo didn't bring even you to the museum. You would have profited more than you would have thought by that trip. Are photo albums of your grandchildren the only pictures you look at? Are you altogether unconscious of the magic of the name of Michelangelo? I truly believe that his name is magic even now, the best kind of magic because it comes from true greatness. Claudia sensed it as she stood again in line. The mystery only intrigued her. The magic trapped her. Both children were annoyed when the guards plus the push of the crowd hurried them past the angel. How could they possibly look for fingerprints when they were so rushed? After this hurried visit to the statue, they decided to do their research when they had the statue and the museum to themselves. Claudia especially wanted to make herself important to the statue. She would solve this mystery, and it, in turn, would do something important to her, though what this was she didn't quite know. As they once again reached Sir James, Jamie answered, "Oh, I don't know, dear Lady Claudia. Shall we find a good and proper group?" "Yes, let us, Sir James." Thereupon, Jamie held out his arm, Claudia rested the tips of her fingers on the top of his hand, and they descended the stairs. They proved to be as fussy in their selection as Goldilocks. This group was too old, that group too young, this too small, that all girls. But they found a good and proper group in the American wing, where they spent a lovely and informative hour and a half learning about the arts and crafts of colonial days. They dined with the group, staying always at the rear of the line, always slightly apart. Both Jamie and Claudia had acquired a talent for being near but never part of a group. Some people, Saxenberg, never learn to do that all their lives, and some learn it all too well.